He thought that night would be just a slip, a forbidden whim. The neighbor crying at the door, her dress clinging to her rain-soaked body, those pleading eyes he could no longer ignore. He took her for himself, taking her virginity with a mixture of desire and guilt, believing he was just a weak man before temptation. But when she, still naked in his sheets, revealed the secret that had brought her to him, his peace shattered like broken glass. That girl wasn't just a victim of fate, and now trapped in her lips, her body, and her shadows, he would discover the devastating price of having crossed the line. Because after her, there was no way back. If intense and unexpected love stories like this touch your heart, subscribe to the channel and comment what you think. Every day we post new plots that move and surprise. Discover now the romance that no one dared to live. The March rain in Denver had the metallic smell of changes that no one can predict. Henry Sullivan adjusted his tie knot for the third time that morning, observing in the bathroom mirror the reflection of a 42-year-old man who seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime on his shoulders. The duplex apartment in Cherry Creek was silent as always. Julia had already left for the beauty salon she managed downtown, leaving only the sickening aroma of the French perfume she insisted on wearing since college. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of punctual dinners at 8, conversations about investments and renovations, protocol sex on Saturday nights. Julia was a beautiful woman. He had never denied that. But there was something in her that had crystallized over time, a coldness that seemed to sprout from within, like ice forming in still water. They met in business administration college, dated for 4 years, married in a ceremony that cost more than an apartment, and since then lived in a silent dance of politeness and indifference. Henry worked at a mid-sized construction company, occupying a management position that gave him comfort without ostentation. He wasn't rich, but had enough to maintain the standard of living Julia demanded. Well-located apartment, current year car, annual vacations in Aspen or Napa Valley. A median life, safe, predictable. A life that until recently he believed was the most he could expect from existence. It was on a Friday afternoon, while watering the balcony plants, that he truly saw her for the first time. Marina Parker lived in the back house of the neighboring building, an old construction that contrasted with the modern buildings that were appearing in the neighborhood. She must have been around 25 years old, maybe less, and there was something in her movements that caught attention. She wasn't exactly beautiful in the conventional sense. She didn't have Julia's flawless skin or her always styled hair, but she possessed an intensity that seemed to radiate from within. Henry began to notice the small details, the way she hung clothes on the line, her stretched arms revealing the subtle curve of her waist, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrated, the simple dresses she wore, always a little too loose, as if she were hiding her own body, and especially her eyes. Even from a distance, he could perceive there was something wild in that gaze, a fierce melancholy that clashed with her apparent submission. The observations became a habit. Every morning, while having coffee, Henry would discreetly position himself at the kitchen window, pretending to read the newspaper while waiting for her to appear. He discovered that Marina woke up early, always before 7, and had the habit of sitting on the small wooden bench in the backyard to drink coffee before starting household chores. There was a melancholic routine in those moments, as if she were trying to extract a few minutes of peace before the day swallowed her. Gradually, Henry discovered more about the Parker family's life. The father, Oscar, was a man of just over 50 who worked as a mechanic in a neighborhood shop. The mother, Vera, stayed home, taking care of a small garden and ironing clothes for others. They seemed like simple, hard-working people, but there was something in the family dynamics that bothered Henry. The voices coming from the house always sounded too loud, especially the father's, and several times he saw Marina running to the backyard after arguments that made neighbors close their windows. The first real contact happened on a Monday morning. Henry went down to get mail when he found Marina struggling with a heavy box in her building's lobby. Without thinking much, he offered to help. She hesitated for a moment, her dark eyes studying his face as if trying to decipher his intentions, before accepting with a shy smile that made something strange move in Henry's chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice deeper than he expected. "I could have managed alone, but—" "No need to justify," Henry interrupted, carrying the box to the house door. "I live in the building across the street." "Henry." "Marina." Her hand was small and a bit rough when they shook palms. "I know who you are. I've seen you on the balcony." There was a moment of awkward silence. Henry wondered if she had noticed his observations, if he had been too obvious in his curiosity. But in Marina's smile there was no judgment, just an unexpected complicity, as if she had noticed him too. From that day on, casual encounters became more frequent. Henry began adjusting his schedules to coincide with Marina's. He would go down to get bread from the corner bakery at the same time she returned from the market, check the mail when he saw her sweeping the sidewalk. They were brief conversations, full of pauses and contained smiles, but there was a growing tension in the air, an electricity that neither dared to name. Marina was different from any woman Henry had ever known. She spoke little about herself, but when she did, her words had weight. She told him she had dropped out of education college in her second year because her father couldn't afford to pay anymore, that she worked sporadically as a cleaning lady to supplement the family income, that she dreamed of traveling to places where no one knew her. There was an ancient sadness in her words, but also a silent strength that impressed Henry. "Sometimes I imagine what it would be like to wake up in a different house," she said one afternoon while they shared a bench in the neighborhood park. "In a different city, with different people, being someone completely new." Henry didn't know what to answer. His whole life he had sought exactly the opposite: stability, predictability, the security of waking up every day knowing exactly what to expect. But in Marina's voice, the idea of starting over sounded like the most natural thing in the world. The weeks passed and the attraction between them became undeniable. Henry began fantasizing about Marina during warm nights beside Julia, imagining what it would be like to touch that skin that seemed warmer than normal, what it would be like to hear her voice whispering his name. He felt guilty, but couldn't stop. It was as if Marina had unlocked something that had been sleeping inside him for years. It was on a Thursday night that everything changed. Henry was returning from happy hour that had become tradition with some work colleagues when he saw a strange movement at the Parker house. There was a black car parked in front, and through the illuminated living room window he could see silhouettes gesturing agitatedly. Oscar's voice sounded louder than normal, almost shouting, and occasionally was interrupted by a male voice Henry didn't recognize. Marina appeared at the bedroom window for a few seconds, her pale face highlighted against the light curtain. Even from a distance, Henry could tell she was crying. Something inside him contracted, a protective instinct he didn't know he possessed. He stood on his own apartment balcony, trying to decide if he should do something, when the house door opened violently. A tall man in a dark suit and graying hair came out walking with determined steps to the car. Behind him, Oscar followed, gesturing, his voice loaded with desperation. Henry couldn't hear the words, but the tone was unmistakable, plea mixed with fear. The man in the suit got in the car without looking back, and the sound of the engine cut through the night like a blade. Marina didn't appear in the backyard the next morning, nor the next. Henry tried to maintain normal routine but was restless, his mind constantly returning to the scene he had witnessed. When he finally saw her 3 days later, she seemed different. Thinner, with deep dark circles, shoulders curved as if carrying an invisible weight. "Everything okay?" he asked when they met at the bakery. Marina looked at him for a long moment before answering. "My father has debts," she said simply. "Many debts." Henry waited for her to continue, but Marina just picked up the bread and walked away. There was something final in that gesture, as if she were saying goodbye, and it was at that moment he realized he was in love. Not just attracted or interested, completely, desperately in love with a woman he barely knew, who lived in a completely different world from his, who was clearly facing problems he couldn't understand. The week that followed was pure torture. Henry could barely concentrate at work, answered Julia's conversation attempts with monosyllables, spent hours on the balcony waiting for a glimpse of Marina that didn't come. When she finally appeared, it was on a Friday night, during a torrential rain that had turned the streets into rivers. Henry was arriving home, slightly intoxicated after another frustrated attempt to distract himself at the bar, when he saw her. Marina was sitting on the house doorstep, completely soaked, her dress stuck to her body like a second skin. There was something in her eyes he had never seen before, not just sadness, but a fierce determination, almost desperate. She got up when she saw him and walked to him without saying a word. The rain streamed down her face, mixing with tears Henry wasn't sure existed. And then, without warning, Without permission, without any hesitation, Marina stood on her tiptoes and kissed him. The kiss tasted of rain and desperation, of decisions made at the last moment before the abyss. Her hands clutched his wet shirt, pulling him closer, and Henry felt the entire world reorganize around that moment. When they separated, both were breathless, eyes fixed on each other as if trying to memorize every detail. "I can't go home anymore," Marina whispered, her voice broken by emotion. "Not today." Henry didn't ask why, didn't ask about consequences, about Julia sleeping in the apartment above, about what this meant. He simply took her by the hand and led her to the back room of the building, a small space where the superintendent kept tools and that no one else used. There, between the smell of paint and humidity, they undressed with the urgency of those who know there might not be a second chance. Henry's hands trembled while unbuttoning Marina's wet dress, revealing skin that seemed to radiate its own heat. She was thinner than he had imagined, but there was surprising strength in that small body, an intensity that manifested in every touch, in every sigh. They made love with a mixture of tenderness and desperation that Henry had never experienced. Marina was both fragile and fierce, giving herself completely, but also taking what she wanted, guiding his hands, whispering instructions that ignited him. And when she screamed his name at climax, Henry felt he was discovering for the first time what it really meant to desire someone. Afterward, while she rested nestled in his arms, Marina told the truth. Her father owed an impossible amount to a man known only as the Lawyer, a loan shark who operated in the Denver metropolitan area and who had a reputation for collecting debts in unconventional ways. The threats had started months ago, but in the previous week had become more specific, more personal. "He wants me to settle my father's debt," Marina said, her voice low and controlled. "In a specific way. He said a beautiful daughter is worth more than money." Henry felt anger rise through his chest like lava. "And your parents accepted this?" "My father is desperate. And my mother," Marina sighed. "My mother thinks it's better for me to sacrifice myself for them than for the whole family to die." "And you? What do you think?" Marina turned to face him, her eyes shining in the penumbra of the small room. "I think if I'm going to lose my virginity to save my family, at least I want to choose with whom." The raw honesty of those words hit Henry like a punch. He understood he hadn't been chosen for love or passion, but for being a less terrible alternative to what awaited her. And even so, strangely, this didn't diminish the intensity of what he felt for her. If anything, it made him admire her even more. They remained silent for a long time, listening to the rain gradually diminish outside. Henry knew that night would change everything, that there would be no going back. He also knew he was entering dangerous territory, where the rules he had followed all his life didn't apply. But when he looked at Marina sleeping in his arms, none of that seemed to matter. What he didn't know yet was that the real storm was just beginning. Dawn came loaded with guilt and desire in proportions Henry didn't know how to balance. Marina had left before sunrise, leaving only the soft perfume of her skin impregnated in his clothes, and a feeling of emptiness that seemed to have permanently installed itself in his chest. He went up to the apartment in silence, took a long shower trying to organize his thoughts, and when Julia appeared in the kitchen for breakfast, he had the impression she could see the betrayal stamped on his face. "You arrived late last night," she commented without lifting her eyes from the coffee cup, her voice neutral as always. "The elevator made noise. Meeting with suppliers." Henry lied, surprising himself with how easily the lie came out. "You know how it is. These things extend." Julia nodded and returned her attention to the tablet, checking the salon's appointments. She was a beautiful woman at 40, kept in shape with a personal trainer 3 times a week, and spent a fortune on aesthetic treatments. Her blonde hair always impeccable, nails always done, clothes always coordinated. A perfect wife for a middle-class man who wanted to project success. But that morning, looking at her, Henry wondered when was the last time he had really desired her. The following days were silent torture. Henry couldn't concentrate on work, answered emails automatically, participated in meetings without absorbing a word of what was discussed. His mind was constantly focused on Marina, the texture of her skin, the sound of her sighs, the way she had whispered his name in the most intimate moment. But more than physical desire, what tormented him was worry. What was happening to her? Had the lawyer collected the debt? Was she okay? Was she regretful? For 3 days he didn't see her. The Parker house seemed strangely quiet, curtains closed even during the day. Henry even knocked on the door on Wednesday night, pretending he was looking for a lost cat. But no one answered. Desperation began to take hold of him in a way he couldn't control. It was on a Thursday, exactly 1 week after that rainy night, that Marina reappeared. Henry saw her through the kitchen window, sitting on the backyard bench. But there was something different about her. She was thinner, her face paler, shoulders fallen as if carrying an invisible weight. When their eyes met through the distance between buildings, she didn't smile. She just stared at him for a long moment before going inside. That night, Henry invented an excuse to go out, told Julia he needed to buy medicine at the all-night pharmacy, and hung around the Parker house until he managed to intercept Marina on her way out to the market. "I need to talk to you," he said, trying to keep his voice low. Marina looked around nervously before answering. "It's not safe. My father is getting suspicious." "Then let's go somewhere else, please." She hesitated for a moment that seemed eternal before agreeing. They walked in silence to a diner 20 blocks away, a dark and almost empty place where they could talk without being seen by acquaintances. Marina ordered just coffee, which she stirred nervously without drinking. "Did something happen?" Henry asked, getting straight to the point. "He showed up on Saturday," Marina said, her voice low and controlled. "The lawyer said the deadline expired, and that either I pay my father's debt my way, or my family will pay his way." Henry felt his blood freeze. "And I said I needed more time, that I was trying to get money." Marina finally raised her eyes to look at him. "He gave me until Sunday. 3 days. And after that, he said he'll send some men to talk to my father, and that the conversation won't be friendly." Henry extended his hand across the table and touched hers. It was cold as ice. "There's another solution. You can run away." Marina smiled bitterly. "Where to? With what money? And my parents? Do you think he'll leave them alone if I disappear?" It was a question Henry had no answer for. They remained silent for a few minutes, the weight of the situation hovering over them like a dark cloud. It was then that Marina said something that changed everything. "I thought about you these days," she murmured, without looking at him directly. "About what happened between us. And I realized that for the first time in my life I chose something. It wasn't my father deciding. It wasn't my mother pressuring me. It wasn't necessity forcing me. I wanted to be with you that night." Her words hit Henry like a punch to the stomach. There was a raw honesty there that completely disarmed him. "I thought about you too," he confessed. "All the time. I can't think about anything else." Marina finally took a sip of coffee. "That's dangerous." "Why?" "Because I'm starting to imagine what it would be like if things were different. If I were free, if you were free. If we could just be two people who desire each other, without all this complication around." Henry felt his heart accelerate. "And what would it be like?" "I don't know. But I know I wanted to find out." They left the diner walking side by side, but without touching. There was electric tension in the air, an acute awareness of each other's presence that made every step a small torture. When they reached the corner where they needed to separate, Marina stopped and turned to him. "Do you have a cell phone?" she asked. Henry nodded and gave her the number. Marina memorized it without writing it down. "If something happens," she said, "I'll call. Promise you'll answer?" "I promise." She stood still for a moment, as if she wanted to say something else, before walking away quickly. Henry watched her until she disappeared around the street corner, feeling like a part of him went with her. The next 2 days were agony. Henry kept his cell phone always nearby, checked every few minutes if he hadn't missed any calls. He tried to maintain normal routine, but Julia began making comments about his strange behavior. "You've been very distracted," she said during Saturday dinner. "Problems at work?" "Just some complicated contracts," Henry replied, avoiding her gaze. "Maybe we should take a trip, a few days in Aspen for you to relax." The idea of being locked in a hotel with Julia while Marina faced whatever the lawyer had planned made Henry feel physically nauseous. "It's not a good time," he said. "Maybe next month." Julia studied him for a moment that lasted too long. "Are you sure everything's okay? You seem different." "I'm just tired." She didn't seem convinced, but didn't insist. Henry retreated to the office, pretending to work on reports, but actually watched the Parker house through the window. The lights were on, but there was no movement. The silence seemed ominous. On Sunday morning, Henry woke up with a knot in his stomach. It was ultimatum day. He spent the morning trying to distract himself with household chores, but his eyes constantly returned to the window. Julia went out to lunch with friends, leaving him alone with his growing anxiety. It was around 3 in the afternoon that he saw movement at the Parker house. A black car, the same one he had seen the previous week, parked in front. 2 men got out, the lawyer and another younger guy with broad shoulders and an intimidating expression. They entered the house without knocking. Henry stayed glued to the window, his heart beating irregularly. Through the semi-open curtains of the Parkers' living room, he could see silhouettes moving. Occasionally, a voice would rise. Oscar's, always in a pleading tone. The conversation lasted almost an hour. When the men finally left, Oscar accompanied them to the car. Even from a distance, Henry could see the man was visibly shaken. The lawyer said something that made Oscar nod vigorously before returning home with hurried steps. Henry's cell phone rang at 7 in the evening. "Hello?" he answered, recognizing Marina's number. "It's me." Her voice was strange, too controlled. "Can you talk?" "Yes, Julia's not here. What happened?" "He came today, said the deadline ended and that Monday night he'll send someone to get me, to take me to a place where we'll settle accounts." Henry closed his eyes, feeling anger burn in his chest. "And your parents?" "My father agreed. Said it's better for me to sacrifice myself than for the whole family to die." Her voice broke a little. "My mother cried, but didn't say anything. You can't accept this. I have no choice. There's always a choice." There was a long silence on the other side of the line. When Marina spoke again, her voice sounded different, more determined. "Actually, I called because I wanted to ask you a favor." "Anything. I want to spend this night with you. The whole night. It might be the last time I make a free choice in my life, and I want to choose to be with you." Henry swallowed hard. "Julia will be back in a few hours. Then let's go somewhere else. A motel, a hotel, doesn't matter. I just need to feel like I still have control over something." The plea in her voice was impossible to resist. "Where do you want me to meet you?" "Do you know the Star Motel on Highway 25? It's far enough for no one to recognize us." Henry knew the place by name, although he had never frequented it. "I'll meet you there in an hour." "Henry?" "Yes? Thank you for everything." She hung up before he could respond. Henry stood still for a few minutes, the phone still in his hand, trying to process what he was about to do. He was getting more and more deeply involved in a dangerous situation, betraying his wife, putting his stable life at risk for a woman he barely knew. And even so, he couldn't imagine doing anything else. He invented an excuse for Julia, said he needed to go to the office to solve an emergency, and left home with his heart racing. The motel was 40 minutes away, in an industrial region where streetlight illumination created yellowish circles on the wet asphalt. It was exactly the type of place he had never imagined frequenting. Marina was already waiting in the parking lot when he arrived. She wore a simple black dress and a denim jacket, her hair tied in a low ponytail. There was something different in her posture, not the resigned submission of recent days, but a fierce determination, almost defiant. "I thought you wouldn't come," she said when he approached. "I always come when you call." They rented a simple room with a double bed, air conditioning, and a small television. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, and more importantly, it was private. As soon as the door closed, Marina turned to Henry with an intensity that caught him off guard. "Tonight I don't want to think about anything else," she said, walking to him. "I don't want to think about what will happen tomorrow. I don't want to think about consequences. I just want to feel." She kissed him before he could respond, but there was something different in that kiss. It was more urgent, more desperate, as if she were trying to extract all the life she could from that moment. Her hands worked quickly on his shirt buttons while he struggled with her dress zipper. They made love with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Marina was bolder this time, taking initiatives that surprised and ignited him. She guided him, whispered in his ear what she wanted, moaned his name like a prayer. And when they reached climax together, Henry was certain he would never be the same again. Afterward, while she rested nestled in his arms, Marina told more about her life, about how she had always felt trapped, first by her parents' expectations, then by the family's financial situation, about the dreams she had abandoned, the plans she had never been able to put into practice. "You know what hurts me most?" she said, tracing lazy circles on his chest. "It's not even what's going to happen to me. It's knowing that after all this, my parents will continue being the same. They'll get other debts, other problems, and I will have sacrificed myself for nothing." Henry hugged her tighter. "Don't talk like that. It's the truth. You know it is." They made love 2 more times during the night, each time with a different urgency, as if they were trying to memorize every touch, every sensation. Between one time and another, they talked about everything and nothing, about books they had read, places they would like to know, childhood memories. There was an intimacy there that went far beyond the physical, a connection Henry had never experienced. When dawn began to lighten the motel curtains, they knew they needed to separate. Marina dressed in silence, avoiding his gaze. "What's going to happen now?" Henry asked. "Now I go back home and wait," she replied, adjusting her jacket. "And you go back to your life." "Marina, no." She turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Don't make this harder than it already is. Please." She approached him one last time, deposited a soft kiss on his lips, and left without looking back. Henry sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after she left, trying to understand how his life had become so complicated in such a short time. What he didn't know was that that night had been just the beginning, and that the revelations that were to come would shake the foundations of everything he believed in. Monday dawned with a sky loaded with dark clouds that seemed to reflect Henry's state of mind. He had spent all of Sunday in a state of alert, obsessively checking his cell phone, watching the Parker house through the window, trying to elaborate some plan that could save Marina from the situation she was in. But every scenario he imagined ran into cruel reality. He didn't have enough money to pay off the debt, didn't have contacts in the underworld to negotiate with the lawyer, and any attempt to involve police could result in even worse consequences for the Parker family. Julia noticed his agitation during breakfast, but he managed to deflect her questions with excuses about work pressure. What tormented him most was the feeling of helplessness. For the first time in his life, he cared deeply about someone and couldn't protect her. The office routine became torture, each minute dragging like an eternity while he imagined what might be happening to Marina. It was around 3 in the afternoon that he received an unexpected call. The number wasn't saved in his contacts, but he recognized the voice immediately. "Henry Sullivan?" The voice was deep, measured, with an accent he couldn't identify. "Yes, who's speaking?" "My name is Edward Mason. I believe you know a person who interests me very much." Henry's blood froze. It was the lawyer. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do. Marina Parker. A very interesting young woman, don't you think? With a peculiar taste for older married men." The implicit threat in the words made Henry clench his fists. "What do you want?" "A conversation. Tonight at 9 o'clock at Joe's warehouse on Volunteer Boulevard. Come alone. And if I don't go, then tomorrow you'll read about an entire family that was victim of a very tragic accident. Domestic accidents are so common lately, aren't they?" The line went dead. Henry stood still for several minutes, the phone still in his hand, trying to process what he had just heard. How did the lawyer know about him and Marina? Had someone seen them? Or was there a more sinister explanation? The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of anxiety and speculation. Henry tried to concentrate on work, but it was impossible. At 6 in the evening, he invented an excuse to leave early and drove home, where he found Julia organizing papers on the living room table. "You arrived early," she commented without lifting her eyes from the documents. "Actually, that's good. We need to talk about some things." "What kind of things?" Julia finally looked at him, and there was something different in her expression, a coldness that went beyond usual, almost calculating. "Sit down, Henry. It's about business." He reluctantly sat in the armchair opposite the sofa. The papers scattered on the table seemed to be contracts or legal documents, but he couldn't read the content from a distance. "You know the salon has been doing very well lately," Julia began, organizing the papers with precise movements. "So much that I'm thinking about expanding, opening a second location." "That's great," Henry replied, unable to concentrate on the conversation. His mind was focused on the meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock. Yes, only for that I need working capital, a significant investment. She picked up one of the documents and extended it to him. That's why I'm going to need to use our house as collateral for some loans. Henry took the paper without much interest, but the words on the page made his blood freeze. It wasn't a commercial loan contract. It was a property transfer document, and the beneficiary's name was Edward Mason. "What is this?" he asked, his voice coming out louder than intended. "It's exactly what it looks like," Julia replied calmly. "I'm transferring our house to an investor partner." "Edward Mason? Who the hell is Edward Mason?" The smile that appeared on Julia's face was different from any expression he had ever seen on her. Cold, calculating, almost cruel. "You don't know him? How strange. I thought you had already met." Henry felt the world spin around him. You know the lawyer?" "The lawyer?" Julia laughed, a sound that had nothing funny about it. "Is that what they call Edward on the street? How dramatic. I've known him for a long time, Henry. Actually, it was through him that I discovered your nighttime adventures." The revelation hit Henry like a shot. "What are you talking about?" "About the Star Motel, dear. About your mysterious outings. About your sudden obsession with the kitchen window." Julia got up and walked to the window, pointing toward the Parker house. "About your infatuation with the mechanic's daughter." Henry also got up, his legs wobbly. "How did you know?" "Edward has eyes all over the city. When he mentioned that one of his client's husbands was getting involved with one of his debtor's daughters, it was easy to connect the dots." Julia turned to face him. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice? 20 years of marriage, Henry. I know you better than you imagine." "Clients?" Henry repeated, trying to understand. "What clients?" "The salon isn't just a salon, dear. It's a, how can I put it, business platform. Edward helps some of my clients with financial problems, offers special loans, and I help him find creative forms of collection." The truth fell on Henry like an avalanche. "You're involved in this, in the loan sharks, in the threats." "Involved is too strong a word. I just facilitate some contacts. Introduce people who need money to someone who can lend it. What happens after that isn't my problem." "And Marina? Did you know what he was going to do to her?" Julia shrugged. "People make choices. The Parkers chose to borrow money, chose not to pay on time, chose to offer their daughter as collateral. I didn't force anyone to do anything." Henry felt a rage he had never experienced before. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a calculated cruelty that revealed a person he had never really known. "You're monstrous," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "I'm practical," Julia corrected. "And rich. Do you think our comfortable life came from where? From your mediocre salary? From my little neighborhood salon? Edward and I have been partners for 5 years, Henry. This house, the car, the vacations, all financed by our joint business." "Our business? I never knew anything about this." "Because you never asked. It was always convenient for you to believe I was just a successful salon owner. You never questioned where the extra money came from, never showed interest in the details." Julia sat down again, crossing her legs elegantly. "By the way, technically you're also a partner. Your name is on all the documents. If this ever comes to light, you'll be as guilty as I am." The trap closed around Henry like a net. He was implicated in crimes he didn't even know existed, married to a woman who was practically a criminal, in love with a girl who was being used as a piece in a sordid game of power and money. "What do you want from me?" he asked, letting himself fall back into the armchair. "Edward wants to meet you personally. He wants to clarify some things about your participation in our business." Julia checked her watch. "By the way, you have a meeting with him in 2 hours. How do you know that?" "Because I was the one who suggested it. Edward was inclined to solve the problem in a more definitive way. I convinced him that a conversation would be more productive." Henry closed his eyes, trying to organize his thoughts. "And Marina? What about her? Where is she? What did you do to her?" Julia sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Marina is fine, for now. Edward is a businessman, not a sadist. He just wants to solve the debt issue. By making her pay with her body. People pay with what they have. Some pay with money, others with properties, others with services." Julia made a deliberate pause. The Parker family chose this form of payment. They didn't choose anything. They were forced. Henry, dear. Julia got up again, walking to him. You're being very naive. This world doesn't work based on romanticism and sudden passions. It works based on power and money. Edward has both. The Parker family has neither. You... She paused, studying his face. You have something Edward wants. What? Your cooperation. Your more active participation in the business. And mainly, Julia smiled that cold way again, your influence over Marina. Henry didn't understand immediately. What influence? The girl is in love with you, Henry. Edward noticed that. And a woman in love is much easier to control than a revolted woman. Julia leaned in, bringing her face close to his. Edward wants you to convince her to accept the situation, for you to make her understand that it's better to collaborate than resist. The proposal was so abominable that Henry needed a few seconds to fully process what was being asked. You want me to convince her to prostitute herself? Don't be dramatic. Edward isn't a vulgar pimp. He has specific clients with specific needs. Rich, discreet men who pay well for quality company. Julia sat down again. Marina would be treated like a lady. Expensive clothes, her own apartment, generous allowance. Much better than the miserable life she has now. And you think I'll accept this? I think you'll do whatever is necessary to keep her alive. Because that's the alternative, Henry. Either she accepts to work for Edward voluntarily, or... Julia didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. Henry got up abruptly, walking to the window. The Parker house was dark, without movement. Where would Marina be at this moment? Was she afraid? Was she hurt? Was she thinking about him? I need to see her, he said without turning around. That can be arranged. After your conversation with Edward. And if I refuse to cooperate? Then you'll discover it's very easy to plant evidence of crimes you didn't commit. And very easy to make inconvenient people disappear. Julia's voice maintained the casual tone, as if she were discussing dinner menu. Edward is a very creative man when it comes to solving problems. Henry turned to face her. When did you become this person? I've always been this person, Henry. You just never paid enough attention to notice. And at that moment, looking at the woman he had shared a bed with for 20 years, Henry realized that maybe he had never really known her. The Julia he imagined, cold but harmless, distant but fundamentally decent, had never existed. It was an illusion he had created to justify his own accommodation. At 8:30 in the evening, Henry was driving through the dark streets of Denver toward Joe's warehouse. He had considered not showing up, but knew that would only make things worse for Marina. He needed to see her, make sure she was okay, and maybe find a way to get her out of that situation. The warehouse was in an industrial area of the city, between abandoned warehouses and transport companies. It was a large, poorly lit building with several loading and unloading docks. Henry parked the car and walked to the main entrance, where he was received by a tall, muscular man who quickly searched him before indicating the way. The warehouse interior had been partially converted into an improvised office. There were tables with computers, metal files, and several people working even at that hour of night. At the back of the space, behind a glass partition, was Edward Mason. The lawyer was different from what Henry had imagined. He wasn't a stereotypical criminal, but a well-dressed, middle-aged man with graying hair and prescription glasses. He looked more like an accountant or a real lawyer than a loan shark. When Henry approached, Edward stood up and extended his hand with a cordial smile. Henry, pleasure to finally meet you personally. Julia talks about you a lot. Henry shook the offered hand, feeling the firmness of the grip. Where's Marina? Edward laughed. Straight to the point, I like that. She's safe, don't worry. By the way, she asked me to give you this. He extended a small folded paper. Henry opened it and immediately recognized Marina's handwriting. Don't believe everything they tell you about me. Trust only what you know is true. She's an intelligent girl, Edward commented, sitting down again. And very loyal. Rare qualities lately. What do you want from me? Sit down, Henry. Let's talk like civilized men. Reluctantly, Henry sat in the indicated chair. Edward settled behind the desk, joining his hands on the surface. First, I want you to understand that I'm not the villain of this story, Edward began. I'm a businessman. I offer financial services to people who can't access the traditional banking system. I charge high interest, yes, but I take risks no bank would take. Financial services? Henry couldn't hide the sarcasm. Exactly. The Parker family needed money to pay for grandmother's medical treatment. No bank would lend to a mechanic without solid guarantees. I lent. Edward opened a folder and showed documents. $50,000 with a 1-year payment term. Henry looked at the papers. They seemed legitimate with signatures and official stamps. The problem, Edward continued, is that they only paid 3 installments. When I tried to renegotiate, Mr. Oscar offered me an alternative guarantee. The daughter. Not in the terms you imagine. Marina would work for me for 2 years in administrative activities to pay off the debt. An honest job with fair salary. Henry looked at him with skepticism. And why all this staging? The threats, the fear? Because Marina refused. Said she'd rather have the family lose everything than work for me. A noble attitude, but impractical. Edward leaned forward. That's when your wife suggested a more creative solution. What solution? That I use you as an intermediary. Julia said Marina had fallen in love with you, and that maybe she'd accept the proposal if it came from someone she trusts. The trap was closing, and Henry began to understand the real extent of the manipulation. You planned all this, the meeting with me, the desperate situation, even. The first encounter between you was genuine, Edward interrupted. But since then, yes, we've been facilitating circumstances. Facilitating how? Edward smiled. Henry, did you really think a girl like Marina would be interested in a 42-year-old married man without a specific reason? The words hit Henry like a slap. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I instructed Marina to approach you, to seduce you, to make you fall in love with her. Edward opened another folder, and I must admit she did an excellent job. Henry's world collapsed. Everything had been a lie. The passion he believed was reciprocal, the connection he thought he had felt, the intimate moments he considered genuine, all acting. She was following orders? He asked, his voice coming out hoarse. Initially, yes, but Edward made a dramatic pause. Sometimes fiction becomes reality, and I believe that happened in your case. Henry no longer knew what to believe. Where is she? Here, in the back room. Want to see her? Yes. Edward got up and led him down a narrow corridor to a door at the end of the warehouse. He knocked 3 times before opening. Marina was sitting in a simple chair, wearing the same clothes from the last time they had seen each other. When she saw Henry, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't get up. Hi, she said simply. You have 15 minutes, Edward announced before leaving and closing the door. Henry approached slowly, trying to read the expression on her face. Are you okay? Physically, yes. Marina. He hesitated, not knowing how to ask the question. Everything that happened between us, was it true? She stared at him for a long moment before answering. Some things were lies, others became truth. A tear ran down her cheek. I didn't expect to really fall in love with you. So you did fall in love? Yes. And that's what ruined everything. Marina's words echoed in the small room like an echo of everything Henry felt but couldn't express. She had truly fallen in love, just like him, and that had complicated a game that should have been simple manipulation. Henry approached her, kneeling beside the chair to be at eye level with her. What do you mean by ruined everything? He asked, holding her hands between his. Marina looked at the door, making sure they were alone, before lowering her voice to a whisper. Edward expected me to seduce you, and then convince you to accept his proposal, for me to make you believe that working for him would be the best solution for all of us. She paused, her eyes shining with a determination Henry hadn't seen before. But I really fell in love with you. And when you really fall in love with someone, you can't pretend anymore. Marina, let me finish, she interrupted, squeezing his hands. In recent weeks, while Edward thought I was following his plan, I was actually collecting information. Recordings, documents, proof of everything he and Julia do. Henry felt his heart accelerate. What kind of proof? Edward is more than a loan shark, Henry. He's involved in money laundering, tax fraud, extortion. And Julia isn't just a passive partner. She's responsible for a network of beauty salons in 3 states that functions as a front for his illegal business. Marina leaned closer. I have it all recorded. Conversations, meetings, money transfers. Enough to put both of them in prison for a long time. The revelation hit Henry like lightning. How did you get this? Edward underestimated me. He thought I was just a naive and desperate girl. He didn't realize I've been working as a cleaning lady for years and learned to be invisible in the places where I clean. A sad smile appeared on her face. People talk about everything in front of the cleaning lady, as if she were a piece of furniture. And where is this evidence? Safe, hidden in a place only I know. Marina got up from the chair, walking to the small room window. But Edward is starting to suspect. That's why he scheduled this meeting today. He wants to use you to pressure me into accepting the proposal. And if you don't accept, he said he'll make my family disappear. And then he'll make you disappear too. Marina turned to face him. But I have a plan. Before Henry could ask what the plan was, the door opened and Edward entered, followed by two men Henry hadn't seen before. The atmosphere changed instantly, tension growing like electricity in the air. "Time's up," Edward announced with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you had a productive conversation." "We need more time," Henry said, instinctively placing himself between Edward and Marina. "Time is a very expensive commodity, my friend, and you've already consumed more than you could afford." Edward gestured to the men, who positioned themselves blocking the exit. "Marina, dear, I hope you explained the situation to Henry." "I did," Marina replied, her voice surprisingly calm. "I explained that you're a criminal, an extortionist, and that you plan to use me as a prostitute to pay off a debt you deliberately inflated." The smile disappeared from Edward's face. "Watch your words, girl. You're not in a position to make accusations." "Aren't I?" Marina laughed, a sound that had nothing funny about it. "Then maybe you should listen to this." She took a small digital recorder from her pocket and pressed play. Edward's voice echoed in the room, clear and unmistakable. "The girls who work for me aren't exactly administrative employees, if you know what I mean. They provide special services for a very specific clientele, rich men who value discretion." Edward lunged toward Marina, but Henry intercepted him. "Don't touch her. You have no idea what you're getting into," Edward growled, signaling for the men to approach. "Actually, I do," Marina said, raising her voice. "And you should also know that this recording is just one of many. And if anything happens to me or Henry, all of them will end up in the hands of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Edward stopped, his eyes narrowing. "You're bluffing." "Am I? Want to bet your freedom on it?" Marina took a step forward, facing him fearlessly. "I know about the $300,000 you laundered through Julia's salon last month. I know about the fake invoice scheme. I know about the politicians who receive bribes to turn a blind eye to your business." Edward's face color changed, going from irritation to something close to panic. "Where did you get this information?" "You taught me that information is power. So I decided to become very well informed about you." Marina crossed her arms. "The question now is, do you want to negotiate, or do you prefer I turn everything over to the authorities?" Henry watched Marina's transformation with a mixture of admiration and amazement. This wasn't the fragile, submissive girl he thought he was protecting. This was a strong, intelligent woman who had spent weeks planning her own liberation. Edward remained silent for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he gestured for the men to step back. "What do you want?" he asked. "First, my family's debt is settled. You'll sign a document declaring you owe nothing more to the Parkers." Marina spoke with the authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "Second, you'll stay away from me and my family permanently. And in exchange? In exchange, I don't turn the recordings over to police. For now." "For now?" Edward repeated. "That's right. Because if someday, for any reason, anything happens to me or anyone in my family, the recordings will automatically appear. I've organized everything so that if I don't check in at certain places at certain times, the material goes directly to the press and the FBI." Edward looked at Henry, then back at Marina. "And him? What's the unfaithful husband's role in this whole story?" "His role," Marina said, walking to Henry and taking his hand, "is to choose whether he wants to continue living a life based on lies or if he wants to start over from scratch with me." Henry felt all the puzzle pieces falling into place. Marina had transformed a situation where she was a victim into one where she was in control. She had used her own vulnerability as a weapon apparent submission as a disguise to collect the information she needed to free herself. "I choose you," he said without hesitation. "I choose to start over." Edward laughed bitterly. "You think it's that simple? That you can just walk away and live happily ever after?" "No," Marina replied. "I know it will be difficult. I know we'll have to leave Denver, start from scratch somewhere else. I know Henry will have to get divorced and probably lose everything he built here." She looked at Henry. "But sometimes freedom costs everything you have." Henry squeezed her hand. 20 years of marriage, a lifetime of security and predictability, a stable career. All of this weighed in the balance against the possibility of a real life, beside a woman who made him feel truly alive for the first time. "I accept," he said. "I accept paying that price." Edward observed them both for a moment, then sighed in defeat. "Very well, you won this round. But remember, the world is small, and I have a good memory. And I have enough evidence to put you in prison for the next 20 years, Marina retorted. "So I suggest you have a very selective memory from now on." 2 hours later, Henry was standing at the door of his apartment, a small suitcase in his hand and a divorce document drafted on a sheet of paper. Julia was sitting on the living room sofa, her expression cold as always, but there was something different in her eyes. Maybe fear, maybe respect. "So this is it?" she asked. 20 years thrown away for a middle-age infatuation? 20 years of lies thrown away for a chance at honesty, Henry corrected. "You deceived me, Julia. About who you were, about how you lived, about everything. And you think she didn't deceive you too? You know she was following Edward's orders at the beginning." "I know. And I also know she switched sides when she truly fell in love. When she had to choose between security and love, she chose love." Henry headed for the door. "Something I should have done a long time ago." "Henry," Julia called when he was already leaving. "Are you sure it's worth it? Losing everything for someone you barely know?" He stopped at the threshold, thinking about the question. Then he turned to look at her one last time. "Julia, I lived 20 years knowing you and didn't know who you really were. I've known Marina for a few weeks, and she had the courage to show me even her darkest sides. So yes, it's worth it." Marina was waiting at the corner, a small backpack on her shoulders and a nervous smile on her face. When she saw Henry approaching, her eyes filled with tears of relief. "You came," she said. "I promised I would come." They embraced in the middle of the sidewalk, under the yellowish light of the street lamps, aware they were starting something completely new and uncertain. In Henry's pocket was the phone number of a lawyer Marina had recommended, someone specialized in witness protection. In the coming weeks, they would have to cooperate with authorities, testify against Edward and Julia, rebuild their lives from scratch. "Where are we going?" Henry asked. "I have a cousin in Miami who can host us for a few days," Marina replied. "After that, I don't know. We can go anywhere." They walked to Henry's car, but before getting in, Marina stopped and faced him. "Henry, I need you to know something," she said. "Everything I felt for you was real. Even when I was following Edward's orders, even when I was trying to manipulate you, there was a part of me that genuinely connected with you." "I know," he replied, gently touching her face. "And you need to know that I choose you every day. Not just today, not just because I'm running from a life I no longer want. I choose you because you made me remember it's possible to feel something true." They kissed there, on the dark street of a neighborhood they were leaving behind, and there was something different in that kiss. It wasn't the desperate urgency of previous encounters, nor the forbidden passion of hidden moments. It was the promise of an uncertain but genuine future. They got in the car and began driving through Denver's empty streets. Henry didn't know what awaited them. Probably difficult months, complete reconstruction of their lives, the pressure of testifying against dangerous people. But for the first time in a long time, an uncertain future seemed better than a guaranteed present. "Do you regret it?" Marina asked when they were already on the highway, the city lights diminishing in the rearview mirror. "Regret what?" "Giving up everything. Your stable life, your security." Henry looked at her in the passenger seat, her loose hair dancing with the wind from the half-open window, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and hope. This was the woman who had risked everything to free herself, who had transformed her own vulnerability into strength, who had chosen love even knowing it would cost dearly. "Marina," he said, extending his hand to touch hers. "I spent 42 years living with security and predictability, and they were the emptiest years of my life. These last weeks with you, even with all the danger and uncertainty, were more real than all the other years combined." She intertwined her fingers with his. "And now we discover together what it's like to really live." They drove through the night, two fugitives from their own lives, carrying only the essentials and a promise that no matter what came ahead, they would face it together. Behind them were the lies, manipulations, lives built on false foundations. Ahead was the unknown, frightening and liberating at the same time. When the sun rose, they were on a secondary road near the coast, the ocean extending infinitely on the horizon. They stopped at a simple roadside diner to have coffee and plan the next steps. "You know what impresses me most about you?" Henry said, watching Marina stir sugar in her coffee. "What?" "You transformed the most impossible situation into an opportunity to start over. You were being forced into a life you didn't want and managed to completely turn the game around." Marina smiled, and for the first time since they'd known each other, it was a completely free smile, without shadows of fear or worry. "I learned that sometimes you need to accept that you've lost everything to discover what really matters." "And what really matters?" "Freedom, truth, and," she extended her hand across the table, "someone who loves you for what you really are, not for what you can do for them." Henry squeezed her hand, feeling the symbolic weight of the wedding ring he had taken off during the trip. Two lives that crossed at the exact moment when both needed change. Two people who discovered that true love is worth any sacrifice. 3 months later, in a small coastal town in Florida, Henry opened a small administration consultancy while Marina began working at a local school. They were simple, modest lives, very different from what either had imagined for themselves. But they were true lives, built on conscious choices and genuine love. And every night, when they lay down in the small house they rented 2 blocks from the beach, they knew they had made the right choice. They had traded security for freedom, appearances for truth, accommodation for passion. The price had been high, but the reward was priceless. 2 people who had finally found where they belonged, in each other's arms, free to love without fear, without lies, without limits. And when Marina fell asleep, nestled against Henry's chest, listening to the sound of waves through the open window, she knew that all the battles, all the risks, all the courage she had needed to find had been worth it. Because sometimes you need to lose everything to discover that what you really needed was right in front of you, waiting only for you to be brave enough to choose love.